Evening all. Thank you very much for coming along today. I think I know some of you from door knocking around the county, but for those of you that haven't met, I'm Luke Pollard. I'm the Labour and Cooperative Member of Parliament for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport, and I'm also in the Shadow Cabinet as the Shadow Environment Secretary. And I just want to say thank you for inviting me along tonight. I'm going to just briefly just talk about green stuff if I can, because it's the area that I focus on. Look, facing in these elections that we've got in May, we're not going to be able to solve the climate crisis in the next 6 weeks or so, but we do need to make a good case for steps that will get us in that direction of recognizing that we are at a real key point in how we deal with our climate. Now, there's no going back to business as usual, and that is certainly true. It's true for three big reasons. Firstly, Brexit has fundamentally changed our economy. We might not all realise it yet, but it has. Secondly, the pandemic has fundamentally changed the way our economy works, the way that we lead our lives, and it has created a huge economic whirlwind that is following on in its path. Because of the measures that the government has taken, that Labour has called for, and I welcome, like the furlough scheme, we're not yet seeing the true impact of that recession on our communities in the way that I think many of us were expecting. So as an example, Plymouth City Council was expecting 20% unemployment by Christmas. That was the expectation of what we were expecting if the furlough scheme had been removed. 20%, 1 in 5 people. And that's not 1 in 5 people in every community. The poorer communities would have had much bigger unemployment than that. But equally, this is a type of recession that is reaching into every single community that we have. The third one of those that we can't go back to business as usual is because of the climate emergency. Now, this isn't just a carbon emergency, right? This is about climate and ecological crisis. Now, I sometimes bang on a lot about carbon. When I say sometimes, I often bang on a lot about carbon, but I am often aware that that debate can be quite exclusive. It doesn't necessarily include everyone in it. An example I want to give you, and forgive me if I've said this to you before, is carbon's measured in tons, right? What's a ton of carbon look like? If you had a ton of carbon on the table where your computer or your phone is at the moment, how big would it be? Would it be the size of your table? Would it be the size of your house? Would it be the size of your hand? How much is it to go along with? It's one of the things that actually, weirdly, we take for granted. We talk about carbon all the time, but if you don't engage in that debate, how do you access it? A ton of carbon at normal atmospheric pressures is about the size of 2 double-decker buses, right? That's how much a ton of carbon looks like. But that's really hard to understand. And probably most of you lot that are focused on the environment might not have known what a ton of carbon looks like either. So that hopefully will be a shock to the way we talk about climate that will encourage us to talk about it in a slightly different way. Because I think the route for many communities to really buy into the urgent decarbonisation that's required for us as a region, as a country, as a planet, is to frame that decarbonisation journey through nature. Now, throughout the pandemic, we've all appreciated nature more. You might have heard yourself saying, isn't it great hearing the birds sing more? You might have really looked forward to your walk in the park, walk along the coast or along a river. It might be that you have wanted to get into the garden if you're lucky enough to have one. If you've got a bird box or a window box, they might have been a real saviour to you. And if that is the case, and I think it is across the country, then what is going to happen because of that? What's going to change? We need to make that change. We need to make the case for greater access to green spaces, greater access to our natural world, to protection of our vulnerable habitats with a greater urgency than we have before. And when we've got people in every community engaged with that, then we can make a bigger case about more radical action that we need. The reason this matters is because of key Labour values that really matter to me. Now, you all joined the party probably for different reasons, but there's probably some similarities between them. One was social justice, the other one was equality. Well, in the 21st century, we need to add environmental justice into that mix. And the reason for that is because we can't achieve social justice and equality if we don't care about the environmental implications, about the environmental consequences, about the environmental underpinnings of that inequality. And this is the reason why. If you are lucky enough to own your own home, you can borrow against the asset to replace the boiler with an air source heat pump. You can invest in external wall insulation or additional loft insulation. You might be able to afford an electric vehicle or an EV charging point. You can afford to decarbonise. You've got an agency to do that. But if you are on the minimum wage, living in the private rented sector, most of that agency doesn't exist for you. But equally, most of the schemes to decarbonise your life as announced by the government are not open to you either. So we need to make a case that for everyone to decarbonise, for us to decarbonise in every one of our communities, we're going to need to make sure it's not just those that can afford to decarbonise, it's everybody. Now, you might not own your own home necessarily, but you can have a stake in your local park. You might not be able to afford an EV charging point, but you can make the case for putting in beehives in your local community, or to planting a community orchard, or to getting involved in a food scheme locally. There are things that we can do that helps people on the journey. And the reason this matters is because at the last general election, the Tories had an 8-point lead on us on the environment, which I find utterly shocking. The first time I heard it, I was like, really? Really? The Tories? But they did. And when you dig below the figures, people felt that the Labour Party cared about the planet, but the Tories cared about their local community a wee bit more. And that is a challenge for us about how we make our debate accessible to more people. So when we talk about carbon, yes, we need to talk about carbon. We are in a carbon crisis. We absolutely need to decarbonise faster and fairer than we are doing at the moment. But the flip side of the carbon crisis is an ecological crisis, a nature crisis. And we have a choice. We can solve both of them, or we can solve neither of them. And I think we need to, as a party, put nature at the forefront of what we're doing, the cell, more than necessarily the carbon, because if we solve the nature, we solve the carbon. We build greater support for the carbon changes that are required. Now, I would say this because I'm responsible for nature and Ed Miliband's responsible for carbon, but I do put my big size 12s all over his portfolio, left, right and centre, so I hope he forgives me for this. But we do need to make that big change about how we campaign along the way. The other bits that are, I think it's just worth mentioning, especially when we're looking at the West Country, is not everyone is fortunate enough to live in Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport. I know many of you don't quite have that advantage in your own lives, and I sympathise with you for that. But as a party, we haven't always stood up for all those other communities that people live in. And we haven't always turned up. And that is a really important moment for us to also realise about how we win. Now, there are Labour target seats and seats that I want Labour to win in this election that are urban. And we need to have a manifesto and approach that wins in those communities. There are target seats that we need to win, and I want us to win in semi-rural communities and in rural communities at the same time. The Tories have certainly taken kind of rural communities for granted for quite some time, but Labour has not always turned up. And when I got reappointed to this job by Keir, one of the conversations I had with him early doors was, it's not good enough for me just to have rural affairs in my job title. We need to properly live and breathe it. Now we need to do that because not only because half our target seats for 2024 are rural communities, not just because red wall seats are better defined by being rural than being red, but because actually these are communities that need a Labour voice. They need people to stand up for them. So when we're talking about the decline in the high street and the importance of preserving high streets in our towns and our cities, let's also add a sentence about the last shop in the village. Let's also make the case when we're talking about access to public services and GPs and social care, that it's harder to access those in rural communities because of the distance involved. When we're talking about decarbonising transport, yes, let's make the case for more buses, especially in urban areas. But let's realise that the Tories and their decade of austerity have hollowed out rural transport in large parts of the country. So we do need to make sure that when we're restoring bus routes, that they're being restored with proper greener vehicles. But also, we need to make the case that the main form of transport in our rural communities is actually the car. But the last place in the country to see an EV rollout, to see electric vehicle charging points, will be in our rural communities. And that's not right. The Tories aren't saying that. But when we opt out of the debate, when we choose to focus as an urban party, we give up those communities. If we want to be the government of Britain, we have to speak for all of Britain. And I think that is really important in terms of the way that we behave, we act, we campaign, we speak as a party, that I want us to be as inclusive to those folks that live in Plymouth as those folks that live on Dartmoor, people that live on the coast as well as people that live in a tower block. We need to make all those things to make sure that it fits together perfectly. And I think we can do that. And I hope that in these elections, we can put our best foot forwards, hold the Tories accountable for their decade of hollowing out our public services, of underfunding those services that we rely on most as a region, for underfunding nearly everything in the West Country, frankly. There's only one area of spend across the West Country where we're above average, and that's on defence. Now, as someone who campaigns strongly on defence and as Devonport's MP, I do want us to preserve our above average spend on defence. I do want us to have a strong defence. The ship that you see over my shoulder here, HMS Ocean, was sold by the government to Brazil without a replacement, a Tory defence cut. The 2 Devonport-based warships that are being cut by the government are Tory defence cuts. The 10,000 roles being lost in the army are Tory defence cuts. Now, you might not necessarily have a defence community, but let me tell you, there are people in your community that care about our country, care about a strong defence. So we need to make the case for that, because we're not going to make, we're not going to be able to win the election if we shy away from issues that sometimes are difficult for us. So crime, defence, these are issues that matter, but these are issues where the Tories are failing. So we've got an opportunity to do it. And I hope that, taken as a whole, we can be not only critical of where the Tories are getting this wrong, but also positive about where we live. Because I live in an amazing part of the world in Plymouth. You live in an amazing part of the world in Devon. We should be really proud of this, and we know we are. So let's start with a point that says we live in an amazing part of the world. It's incredible. More people want to live here than ever before. More people want to visit here than ever before. But to make the most of this, there are things we have to do. We have to make sure that young people can afford to live in our communities, not go away to get on the housing ladder. We have to make sure that those elderly folks are being able to access social care and the NHS in our communities. We need to deal with the scourge of rural crime and county lines and drug use and abuse and the domestic abuse that's sometimes harder for us to catch in rural areas and across smaller towns. We can do all those things if we make a positive case for it and then a Labour alternative along the way. And I'm really keen to be able to support work taking place right across the county and right across the country as part of this. My word, Liz, there's a million things that I could bang on about in terms of green stuff, because as you might tell, this is an area that I feel a wee bit strongly about. I regard myself as red on the outside and green on the inside. I don't think that should be particular to people that are the Shadow Environment Secretary. There is not an option for our party to be anything other than red on the outside and green on the inside if we are to deal with the pressing crisis that is facing our country. And if we attach social justice equality to environmental justice, we have a very potent and practical recipe for policy in the 21st century. And that needs to apply both in Westminster, in Holyrood, in Cardiff Bay, across Devon and Cornwall. We need to make sure we're making that really strong case for it. And so I won't keep folks much longer for the remarks there, but hopefully that has given you a sense that there are things that each and every one of us can do during these elections leading up to it, and keep going afterwards, because we are going to have a big focus on what's happening between now and May the 6th. And then on May the 7th, well, apart from going to the counts and things like that, we have to start it all over again, because this general election might be in 2024, or it might be sooner. Whenever it comes, I want to make sure that we don't just have 2 Labour MPs in the far southwest at the end of it, that we have at least 5. That means 2 in Cornwall, 2 in Plymouth, 1 in Exeter, and us chasing down the Tories in other parts of our region as well. If we do that, we're on course to return a Labour government. If we don't, we can keep Boris Johnson for a wee bit longer, which may or may not be the thing you're after. I think we can do better than Boris Johnson. I think we can do better than the Tories. And if we are to avoid living on a dead planet, we have to do better on the climate than we are at the moment. So plenty there to go on. If it's helpful, Liz, I'm happy answering any questions that comrades may have.
Yeah, so yes, so I've got we've got a number of other panelists here this evening. So we're going to hear a little bit later from Yvonne Atkinson, who's got a portfolio for Devon on the climate, from Zion, who is an environmental journalist, from Rachel Sutton, who holds the climate brief for City Council in Exeter, and from Matt, who is an environmental campaigner in East Devon. But I think what we'll do for now is just to maximise your time, Luke, we'll come to questions from the public to you, to focus on, yes, on you know, how the budget is going to impact our plans to decarbonise Devon. So if we have anybody who is interested in asking a question, then please do raise your hand.
Can I speak? Real good.
Yes.
Exactly that, really. Which is, how do you see the budget limiting what can be done? What are the limiting factors within the budget, and how are we going to be constrained in terms of ambition to push things forwards, like charging points in rural areas? You know.
It's a great question, Joe. Thank you for that. I think we need to look at the fundamentals of budgets. What is the budget trying to do? At the moment, the budget that was presented, I think, by the Chancellor, and the budget he handed down to every single local council to be able to present in terms of the spending settlements for local government, doesn't recognise the scale of the challenges that are facing our country. And that basic test, I think, has been failed. So it makes all the other challenges that flow from it much harder. So if we're looking at where we are about decarbonisation as an area, well, decarbonisation isn't one action. If it was, it'd be much easier to do. It's a myriad of different things that need to come together. Now, if you haven't read it already, the Committee on Climate Change has some pretty amazing reports on this. They also have some really pretty PowerPoints that explain it in pretty pictures. But effectively, it means that we have to have heavy lifting of decarbonisation effort now to reap the benefits of that if we are to hit net zero by 2030 or any date afterwards. And the government's currently on 2050, but missing potentially where that sits. So we do need to have those big programmes early. So if you look at the housing retrofit programme that was funded, well, the government's now cut £1 billion from it. They've done that because it's not working, right? Having a system where you have to apply by a labyrinthine bureaucracy for a voucher, which then you have to find a provider who will accept the voucher to do work on your property, basically means nobody's using it. If we want to have an approach that decarbonises, that money needs to be put into a street-by-street refurb, right? That looks at a degree of kind of climate universalism that says every single home needs to be decarbonised, and there's a different route to it. If we're looking at how we're going to do for electric vehicle rollouts, well, I'm afraid the budget and the budgets for EV systems are not sufficient to create that big burst that we need. And so in the West Country, well, in Plymouth, we received money from the Transforming Cities Fund. We should have received about 100 million, but because the government's just discovered the north of England after 10 years of not knowing it was there, they moved some of the money that we would have otherwise have got to the north. Now, I have no problem with communities in the north of England getting fairer funded, because my word, they've been denied it for quite some time, but we're losing out in the West Country. So that means that we weren't able to do some of the bigger interventions on EV charging, but actually there is no government plan for EV rollout in rural areas. Okay, it doesn't exist. So if we are to make the case for EV rollout in rural areas, what is the format that delivers that? And so I think there needs to be a certain amount of communities clubbing together, because no matter how much pressure we put on ministers to make a better decision, I think they're going to be slow up until 2024. They'll announce lots of stuff just before a general election for marginal seats with a excise and pork barrelling, but actually the Southwest doesn't have a huge number of marginal seats in the way that I think we need it. And so those 5 that I mentioned might get some focus, but there's, you know, depending on how your conception of how big the Southwest is, there could be up to 40, 50, 60 seats. So how can communities work in cooperative ways to fund EV charging points? How can we work in ways to prioritise local government investment in EV charging? How do we make sure that EV charging is not only put on middle class areas, the affluent areas, but done so in small areas? And I think, I would say this, wouldn't I? But in Plymouth, we're about to roll out 50 travel hubs, as they're called, which has EV charging points and e-bike charging points. Don't forget e-bikes. I think they're a really important part of the short, near-term commuting solution. And they will go in every community, not just in affluent ones. Now, that comes from local government taking the lead, and I know that there's similar but slightly different plans from Exeter and from other councils trying to make the most of what funding is available. But frankly, there is not enough funding available, and there's not enough focus on that decarbonised effort. There's some good headlines, and if we are only focusing on some peripheral activities, then we can. But if we're comparing ourselves with our near neighbours, our friends in the EU, well, Germany has put as much investment in their budget into hydrogen technology than we have put into all forms of green technology in the latest budget. Okay, one technology versus all of them. Now, we can tell ourselves that we've made big steps forward, and certainly compared to where we were, we probably have, but those big steps forward are slower steps than our competitors. Now, that not only affects our decarbonisation journey, it affects our ability to have employment at the same time. So I think there's hopefully, Joe, in that there's enough to unpack about the big strategic questions, and then the lower, the ones that the local councils can deliver, because frankly, local councils don't have any money to do most of these projects. So having the expectation that local councils can in of themselves turn around situations, persuade everyone to get out of their car and into an EV or on a bus with virtually no money is pretty difficult.
Could I just really quickly we've just bought a hybrid that we're picking up on Thursday, and we've been looking in Tiverton, my area, and the only place that there is for charging is Tesco car park. Is there something that can be done in terms of planning that any new build applications with any car parking, that it's insisted that EV charging points is an essential part of whatever new build is?
I think it absolutely should be. The government has been going in the opposite direction for planning policy in terms of mandating stuff, and certainly both in terms of planning, but also in terms of housing, building regulations, they've been going backwards. So I think there is a strong case for that. There's also a strong case for building the infrastructure in the roads before the infrastructure is required. And so one of the big problems about EV charging points is lots of our streets have 2-phase power, but not 3-phase power. And this gets a bit above my head in terms of techie science folk. We'll be able to understand it a bit better than I can, but it basically means that we not only need to put in charging points, we need to put in the pipes that make that work as well. So there is a real requirement for doing it. Not everyone has a drive, and I think some of the sometimes spear chargers, the things that pop up from the street, I think potentially look really good. And if you're looking at Exeter or Plymouth or Torbay or any of the kind of larger urban areas, there's too many people living on terrace streets to be able to cope with a drive-only strategy for EV charging or car park-only strategy for EV charging. We're going to have a terraced street strategy for EV charging. Now, that does require a different form of investment to get there, but it's absolutely essential we look at how we do that. But well done for investing in that. And, be cheeky, tell people about your journey. Write to your local paper to say, I've done this, I've invested in this, this is my journey. Do you know how difficult it is to get somewhere, to get an EV charging point? Tell your story about it. It's much more compelling than having me on a national basis say, there's not enough charging points, which there aren't, but actually localize it to your community and says, there's one here and there's one 20 miles away. That's not enough to persuade more people to make the move that's required. Bear in mind that diesel and petrol engines stop being sold in 2030. Right? They'll still be on the roads for a wee bit longer, but they stop being sold in 9 years' time. So where is the focus on having this structure that means that we can have a system that replaces them? It's not there yet.
Okay, so I've got a couple more. I don't have any hands up, so please put your hand up if you would like to ask a question. But I've got a couple in the chat. So Rose and then Janie. I don't know if you'd like to come in with your questions.
I think it's somebody ahead of me, Liz, actually.
That's okay. I'm going to you, Rose.
Okay. I'd like to ask if there's a case for a big push towards green energy jobs in the southwest as an alternative to having tourism as our main employment.
The answer, Rose, sound like a politician, is we need both. Right. And so there is a big amount of investment going in, especially in terms of floating offshore wind, the huge potential that provides for us, and on more industrial rollout of solar. But actually, that won't replace the amount of jobs that are in tourism. And so we do need to protect our tourist economy, decarbonise those jobs, but also have a focus on higher tech green jobs at the same time. And that needs not only to be about the deployment, but where possible, the construction and servicing at the same time, keeping the funding in local communities about how it works. The only concern that I have about some of the green schemes that have been looked at so far is how much of the benefit will stay in the local community. It's all well and good us having lots of wind turbines, but if all the profits and all the benefits are accrued from businesses based elsewhere, then how does our local community benefit from it? And I think that is a legitimate question to ask about new schemes, because I think there needs to be a more equitable support for local communities if they're having landing points from offshore wind, if they're having onshore solar or whatever it may be. Where's the benefit for the community? And if we can make that case for it, I think more people will support it, but we'll have fewer objections, but we'll also be able to address some of the poor funding by having a revenue stream that comes in using our own natural assets.
Okay, yeah. Yes, a lot of people don't like wind turbines, of course, here. There's a lot of objection to that.
There are, and that's where offshore wind is going to be really important. So personally, I'm a fan of onshore wind, but I think one of the bits that, again, makes it really, if there was a certain percentage of onshore wind that went to the local community where the wind farms are, that provided support for, I don't know, community centres or for local services and things like that, I think communities would be much more likely to support them in their areas. But if the benefits are only coming from the landowner, the farmer, or the the landed gentry that happens to own a bit of the land that is going on, well, how do you make a case that benefits the community? Yes, there's a benefit in the round of decarbonising, of getting greener energy, feeling better about turning your light switch on, knowing it's generated greener. But actually, how do we make a more tangible local benefit of it? And I think there's a strong case to be made that when new schemes are being formed, we need to be building in local presence to some of that benefit share along the way.
Okay, thank you.
So Janie, did you want to come in with your question?
Yes, please, if I can. This has actually come also from the Labour candidate for Northam here in Torridge and West Devon, and it's asking Luke, would you give support for the ban of cheap bodyboards which is run in partnership by Plastic Free Torridge and North Devon, together with Keep Britain Tidy Ocean Recovery Project?
So that is a great question, and I know that's been emailed into my office, and we're looking at what we can do on a bigger scale with that. And so without wanting to bounce the announcement and destroy my media grid, I think there's good news here to be looking out for about where it goes. But I think, you know, if you look at the amount of plastic, especially polystyrene and cheap plastic bodyboards that are discarded every year across the West Country alone, that is an environmental catastrophe. If you look at it on a global scale, there's a lot more. Now, there's been some really good efforts about recycling some surfboards and to less extent bodyboards, but actually that's only going to deal with a very, very small number. So I do think there needs to be a greater focus on the effectively disposable forms of bodyboard, but also on people who are selling them. So Tesco's being a really good example. Well,
Yeah.
if Tesco's stopped selling really disposable cheap bodyboards and started selling ones that had a greater longevity, then we'd be in a better place. I think there's a strong case for that. So thank you for that question. And I'm hoping there will be good news in the media announcement in due course on that one.
Excellent.
Okay.
But keep going on that campaign is what I would encourage you to do.
I'll just take a question from Helen, and then I think we'll go to Matt's comments, if that's okay, Helen.
Yep.
Hi, thanks Liz. Hi Luke. So obviously the pandemic has had big impact on everybody's lives. Many people have adjusted to flying less, and the concern is though, as soon as we can travel abroad, that it will go back to pre-pandemic levels, and the real impact that will have on the environment as well. How can we capitalise on the way that habits have changed, and what should we be doing about this as a party going forward?
It's a really good question. So I think if we as a party said no one should fly, we would not be in a situation where we would be winning many elections. So what we do need to do is make a case for sensible use of carbon about the way, and put greater pressure on the airlines to replace especially aging fleets with more efficient fleets, and then move to cleaner fuels on the way through to electric aviation. So these things sound a bit pie in the sky, but there is a route to get there, but it needs to be accelerated. And I think the government has made first steps in that direction. So the Jet Zero Council is a useful first step, but really there's no money behind it. There's no political priority. There's no big stick that says if it's not done by this point, here's the consequences. So at the moment, it's an initiative rather than a real drive. So we do need to have a focus on that. I think for lots of people, their annual holiday is the thing that they save up for all year round. It is really important for them. It is that moment of escape. It matters more, and my word, it matters so much more because of the pandemic. I think we need to be really clear about where additional responsibility for aviation should rest with. Is it on the family who save up all year to afford a week away in the summer? Or is it on that regular traveller that travels frequently? And I think we should put greater focus on those people that are more frequent users of aviation rather than those people that use it once a year, if that, to get a break. And my word, we all need a break at the moment. So I think that is the place where I'd encourage people to look at where that focus can go. I am biased because I spent 5 years working in the travel industry for ABTA, the represent travels bodies. So I'm a big fan of holidays as a sector. It generates an awful lot of jobs and employment, including in the Southwest. But we need to recognise that that sector is responsible for a lot of emissions, and we need a plan to bring them down and a plan to do so fairly. Aviation is not the only climate impact of tourism, but it is certainly quite a significant one for overseas tourism that we need to address. But we also need to look at our own domestic tourism market as well as to how we can encourage that sector to decarbonise at the same time. But at the moment, keeping those businesses afloat is going to be quite a challenge. So we need to make sure that in arguing for rapid decarbonisation, we do so in a way that doesn't push businesses over the edge. If anything, that's delivered in a way that actually makes business savings for them. Because as the Americans would say, green is green, which is easier to understand when you understand their currency is green coloured. But we do need to make a case for a greener way of doing travel.
Okay, so right, I said I would go to Matt now. I do have a couple of more people with their hands up, Edward and Maureen. So I don't know if you want to just ask your questions together, and then we can go to our next speaker and take some more questions afterwards. Do you want to go, Edward?
All right. Okay. Thank you. Let's see. I noticed. Okay, I noticed. All right. Let's see. I noticed one is probably a bit. I know this one is. Yeah, this one is. I did want to. I'm sorry.
Do you want to put it in the chat and we'll come back to you after Maureen?
Yeah.
Right.
Hi.
Okay,
I've just mentioned I'm an honorary member from Somerset. We haven't got our own SERA branch, so I'm an honorary member of Devon SERA. There are a couple of things. One is, I think Ed Miliband's point that he's making strongly, that it's actually cheaper to spend the money, budget we were talking about earlier, on preventing climate change than actually face the costs when they arrive. And surely that's something we've learnt in the pandemic. If preparation had been paid for up front, we wouldn't have the severe effects we're having now. The other point I want to make is nuclear power. I unfortunately live within sight of Hinkley C being built across the bay, and the Tories are treating nuclear power as if it's an answer to the low carbon. It's only officially low carbon, it's not renewable, but it is so slow, it can't possibly be effective in the timescale we've got left. And the money being spent on it is preventing much better renewables being provided instead. And could Luke explain to me why Labour are still pro-nuclear power and this is the case? Thank you.
Cool. Thanks for that. So let's do nuclear first of all. So in my mind, nuclear is a transition technology. It's not a destination technology which needs to be renewable. However, it is low carbon rather than renewable and effectively zero carbon. So we do need to make the case for it. Nuclear comes with an awful lot of long-term consequences. And I agree with you, that's that. Certainly as an MP that represents Devonport, where we've got the 13 old nuclear submarines still tied up alongside without a plan for recycling them, talking about the nuclear legacy is something that I spend a lot of time doing. We do need a better plan to deal with nuclear legacy than we have at the moment. I think that we need to effectively realise that we're effectively operating a mixed energy policy for the next decade or two, as we try to increase renewables, to increase baseload, to reform the grid to be able to cope with more renewables on the grid, because at the moment, especially in the West Country, we have a real grid issue in terms of the capacity of it for renewables. And then look to phase out not only the coal-fired power stations, which are still operating, albeit at smaller scale. They should be phased out completely by 2025, but I want to see that brought forwards personally, and then look at how we're dealing with natural gas along the way, because we're still burning fossil fuels at a quite significant level. I do want to see a cleaner, greener future. Nuclear, in my mind, is a transition technology, and I think we should be less scared of talking about it with effectively a shelf life rather than as a long-term destination as to where it gets to. Devon SERA is awesome, and so feel free to keep coming across the border to have those debates with us. So we do need to have that, but I think much of the money that's gone into nuclear is from a different funding pot that could have gone into renewables, but some of it it isn't, and so we do need to make the case for greater renewable investment along the way. But I'm not seeing a big change in nuclear policy in the next few years, I'm afraid.
I could say that I go to meetings about the decommissioning of A, and there's such a huge debt coming up of decommissioning old, it's probably not affordable, frankly. And what are you going to do with dangerous old nuclear power stations when you can't afford to decommission them properly? And they aren't really low carbon because they use so much carbon in the production of uranium and so on. So I'm sorry, but do you think we should be pushing this idea of the Ed Miliband's pushing that it's cheaper to spend this money now than on mitigation of climate change, and then wait for a disaster?
Yeah, absolutely. Ed's right about that, and I would add to it that quite a lot of the solutions we need to look at are nature-based solutions rather than just more concrete at the end. But of course, the taxpayer has a liability for all the nuclear power stations as they currently exist under the 2004 Energy Act, which is a good responsibility because it ensures they're cleaned up. And all new power stations, the responsibility falls upon the operator where they come from, so not the taxpayer. There's a lot of problems on this one that we still need to address, but fundamentally nuclear will be part of a transition period to a cleaner future. But we do need to make sure, I think as a movement, we're talking about it as transition rather than destination.
Thanks very much, Luke and Maureen, and all of our people asking questions. I'm going to go to our next speaker, who's Matt Holladay from East Devon, and he's going to share some thoughts, and I'm hoping that some of our other speakers will pick up some of the themes that have been brought up in the questions, and then we'll have time to come back to some of the additional questions I've got Edward, John and Ruth noted down with their hands up to come back to. So over to you, Matt.
Hi everyone, good evening. Firstly, thank you so much, Luke, for attending this evening. And I thought everything there was so interesting, what you were saying about how those decisions at the top with the budget cascade down and are just not providing the funds that we really need to get into this vital area and to build a better future and a lower carbon future for us all. Yeah, really very thought-provoking, and thanks very much. So locally, I've been part of the Broadclyst Environment Group and also got involved with Devon SERA. In the Broadclyst Environment Group that I've been working with, building support within the local community, it's centered around getting people motivated, sharing information on a public forum, and just sort of building those early stages. So very recently, I drew up the constitution for the group, and that was agreed, and the group became an official community group, which then allows it to apply for local pots of funding, for example, from the parish council or other sort of government project grants that would go out. And it's been fascinating seeing everyone getting so excited and interested in it, and planting wildflower seeds, posting pictures of it, going out litter picking, and just getting everyone talking about the environment. And it's amazing how people have become so engaged over this last year. The membership has gone from, you know, the early days of 10 or 20 of us, and it's now at 435 people within the group. And that's just been over the last about 14 months. In quite a small community here in East Devon, and also linking our community group with other ones springing up, so in Pinho, and just the lockdown has really, it's come at the right time. I think the timing is with people becoming a bit more aware. There was so much talk about the environment previously, and the coronavirus crisis has sort of focused people's minds back to what Luke said at the beginning, people noticing nature. And yeah, that's been my involvement. And yeah, I'll go back to Liz.
Thanks very much, Matt. Yeah, and I know we're also working on some agroecology initiatives, aren't we? And these are exciting times. So I'm going to hand over to Rachel, who's hopefully going to tell us about the inspiring stuff for the rest of Devon, about what Exeter City Council's pioneering.
Thanks, thanks Liz, and thanks Luke and Matt. Yeah, apologies for those of you who will have heard this and know it already, but Exeter's has been striving to be an exemplar on reducing carbon for well, I would say best part of a decade. We, as I'm sure most of you know, took a decision that our council house building programme would be passive house. A long time ago, we were one of the earliest authorities to do this, and we're not able to build as many council houses as we would want to, but the ones we are building are passive house, which means that effectively they are so well insulated that the people who are living in them in a lot of cases never turn on their heating the building manages itself. And if you don't know how that works, contact me separately or have a look, because they are astonishingly efficient. And the building that's happening at the bottom of Heavy Tree Road at the moment is going to be the first passive house standard leisure centre and swimming pool in the UK. And I was lucky enough to visit Germany, I think 5 years ago now, might even be coming up for 6 years, and actually see the pools that they've got, and the difference in swimming in a pool with minimum chlorine and in a building that is built to those standards is remarkable, and I can't wait to actually to get and try that out. We've also taken advantage of the opportunity to put solar PV panels on just about every building that we own, including canopies on 2 of our main car parks, and we were one of the earliest local authorities to do that, but also the livestock centre down at Matford, the city council buildings themselves, and numerous other ones. So if you park in Mary Arches Street car park or John Lewis car park, the solar PV on the roof is actually paying the electricity bill and some, and means we can charge for parking but not for charging electric vehicles, and there are some electric vehicle charging points in there, Joe. What else are we doing? Really talk about some of the things that we're moving forward to doing. We are trying to retrofit our council housing stock to make those houses more energy efficient. There's been a pilot project where the houses are kind of, it's almost clad, that there's a kind of shell built round them to actually make them better insulated, so that the heating bills are reduced for the people who live there. And obviously you won't need me to tell you that a lot of people who are living in poorly insulated houses are also suffering other deprivation factors. They tend to be people who are on minimum wage and insecure employment, so actually helping them reduce their bills by addressing their energy bills is going to be positive. And again, we want to be exemplars of best practice, because if we're doing that in our stock, we want to put pressure on other landlords to do that as well. And the other big project we have going at the moment is a solar farm, a solar PV farm being installed, which is European funded, hurrah, and also includes battery storage. It's an experimental project to see if we can generate electricity, store it effectively in batteries, and it's slap bang next to one of our council depots. So the idea is that if we can get our hands on some electric refuse vehicles, that the solar generated down there will actually deal with refueling those vehicles, and you'll actually start to see that happening if you go down by Water Lane in the very near future. The challenge for us is right back to the things that Luke was saying. It's about having lived under a Tory government for a decade, which has been implementing austerity, and the impact of that on local authorities has been absolutely draconian. So it's really hard to be ambitious about what we're trying to do, while at the same time protect the frontline services that local residents need. And really they're not going to be very interested in my solar PV farm if we run out of money and can't empty the bins. So that is the big challenge going forward. Among many of the things that I have issues with the government about is the kind of short-termism about a lot of their funding schemes. I've got really good officers who will write applications at zero notice to get their hands on government money to implement funding and plans, but a lot of that is things have to be literally shovel ready, or they have to be delivered within the current financial year, and quite often you just can't do that. We've funded a lot of what we've been doing by developing the business case for it, but actually doing that takes time. And, you know, kind of, as I say, a lot of these plans come forward and they say, right, you've got 8 weeks to apply for the money and 10 months to spend it. And if you can't demonstrate that you can do that, it's no good, you know, putting the energy into making those applications. And I think the difference in finance terms between what Exeter's doing and what Devon does is Devon seems to be flatly refusing to borrow for anything. And we have an invest to save scheme in Exeter. And if any plans are put forward where the business case demonstrates that within a reasonable period of time we can get a payback on that, we will invest that money. And Devon just don't see it like that. They seem to operate on the, you know, there's a pot of money on the kitchen shelf, and you know, when the pot gets full, they kind of they empty out and have a look at it and decide what to spend it on. So if they were a little more imaginative in terms of investment, there's a great deal more the county council could do. And I know that our Labour colleagues on the county council are doing their best. And you know, I know you are, Yvonne, but you know, how we change that mindset, I really have no idea. And I'm going to stop there because you may have questions and there are other people to listen to.
Okay, so Yvonne, do you want to tell us a little bit about your perspectives and about yourself?
Hello, my perspectives might be a little bit different to some of what you've heard and might upset some of you. So I have a very long history as an environmental journalist and activist. Several years ago, I authored a book on how to lower your carbon footprint using evidence, so using science. I used to be a big Green Party member, obviously not anymore. And, you know, to the point that extent that Natalie Bennett, who was the then Green Party leader, endorsed my book. Her endorsement was on the front of my book. Bill McKibben's endorsement was on the front of my book. It's very much from, I couldn't be from a greener background. I couldn't be from a big, I've been in not just an environmental, you know, journalist, but also right there in the space as an activist. About 15 years ago, I was arrested for protesting tar sands. That was used to be my background. So, you know, really great points being raised. I love, especially, you know, points about rural areas, because I feel like they do get left out, and actually, you know, those are spaces where people do need to drive. So some of these points are super important, and I'm so happy to hear them being covered. But there's other things that are not, I would say, aren't quite right. For example, you know, the climate is an everybody issue. Climate change is a serious issue. We all agree that. We know that it's bad. We know that we need to stop it as soon as possible. We know that if we stop our emissions overnight, it will continue to some degree anyway. But that's okay. You know, it's not. I like Catherine Hayhoe, the climate scientist, where she talks about climate change, which says people get confused and they talk about it as if it's a cliff you're going to fall off and then it's too late. It's not a cliff. It's a slope. And anyway, further down that slope, sure, it gets worse. The temperature, you know, global temperatures increase, and we don't want that. Ideally, we want to stay below 1.5 warming. But even if that doesn't happen, we should never give up. We should always continue to take climate action and try to, you know, bring things back to the state that they should be in. I joined Labour. I left the Green Party. I actually found that a lot of their policies were not evidence-led enough for me, and I feel that Labour could really lead on climate. I've read plans, I read you know, manifestos. I've looked at our policies, and I think that we actually have amazing things that we're not talking about. For example, this thing where people are saying that, you know, the Tories have something on us in terms of climate. It's just not true. You know, yes, Theresa May came up with the net zero 2050, you know, and she came up with a net zero 2050, and then Boris Johnson has had his 10-point plan for the green industrial revolution. But actually, there are so many holes in that, and it's so unambitious. And I would love to see us call that out more. And I don't think that happens. And I think maybe that's a lack of confidence, actually, because Labour does put social justice at the heart of environmental issues. And I say this as a long-term environmental social justice activist. I mean, look at me. My parents are from a poor village in the Punjab. They migrated here in the 60s. I care about social justice. I care about poorest communities. I'm from a very working class background. My parents worked in factories. They worked their entire lives on minimum wage in factories, helping to build Britain back in in the 60s in Birmingham. And the reason I say, the one example I give you for how we're putting social justice at the heart is that when we came up with our net zero target, it was originally 2050, right? That was Labour's target. And when the GMB union said they were concerned about that because it meant that transition might be so fast that a lot of people would lose their jobs, we shifted on that. Now, actually, the papers and the Greens heavily criticised us, saying, oh, they've backtracked. Why have they gone from 2030 to 2050? But if we're putting people at the heart of it, it's brilliant. I mean, we should shout about that. We have to put people at the heart because we are not going to take them along. We're not going to take them along if they are losing their jobs. We're not going to take them along if we don't care about the social justice aspect. We have to be able to do that. It's really important that we're led by evidence. I was happy today. I tweeted this today when I saw Keir Starmer was visiting the Hartlepool nuclear power station, pictures of him on Twitter. I'm very happy to see that. I've come from the Green Party. They're traditionally very anti-nuclear. I've read the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report, the 1.5 warming report, and it does say that we need a transition to nuclear. It's not a temporary transition, and it's quite a lot. It says that we need 50%. This is an international recognised body of scientists. This is climate scientists. These are energy experts. These are not people that we should go against when we say these things. WHO, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations say exactly the same thing. So I don't think that we should be afraid to say these things because they have to happen and they're evidence-led. And I think we should really just own the fact that we're evidence-led, that Keir's not afraid to go into a power station and say, hey, this is giving people jobs and it is completely safe, or it wouldn't be recommended by the IPCC and other international bodies. It is low carbon. Yes, it requires mining. I heard someone say that. I agree, it does require mining. So do solar panels. Solar panels also require mining. The lithium for the batteries also requires mining. All energy requires mining. All energy will have an impact. What we have to choose is options that bring more jobs, which is renewables, it is nuclear, and also the options are energy dense. If we don't do that, we will stay on fossil fuels. And I've been in this fight for a long time, and we are not weaning off of fossil fuels. We still use about 60% gas in the UK. You can check this any day. You can go to electricitymap.org and you can look at our energy mix for any day. And you can also look at the problem of intermittency with renewables. No one wants me to say it, 100% we need renewables, but we do need to deal with this issue of when it's not sunny or windy enough and the renewables drop. You can see on the map, we have to import more coal, and it's bad. We have to stop relying on coal. 21st century, why are we using coal? We can't say in the same sentence, this is a climate emergency, and on the same day be importing coal. These are really important issues that that we need to lead on. And I think people are desperately looking for leaders. And if we're going by evidence and by what the reports are saying, then it's not about being popular or not. It's about actually trying to fix crisis. I have 2 small children. I don't want them to grow up in this awful scenario, this changing world. I have cousins in the Punjab in India already suffering the impacts of frequent drought, so that they can't be rice farmers anymore and they have to migrate. There's serious issues that we should not be afraid to talk about. We have to address people saying things that are not scientific, or people, we have to lead on the science, and the Tory party is not doing it. They're not capable of doing it. I've looked at their plans. There are a lot of holes. Yes, they're building offshore wind. I completely agree, it's really good. But actually, if you look at it, it's a tiny, insignificant amount. It's barely going to meet any of our energy demands. And I don't really see anyone calling that out. And I mean, I called it out in a national paper, and I was heavily criticised for it because you don't criticise renewables. But it's not, I'm criticising renewables. I'm criticising, the fact that about 84% of global emissions are from fossil fuels, right? And fossil fuels, let's not be afraid of nuclear power. Let's be afraid of fossil fuels, which kill 8 million people a year from air pollution alone. That's a real figure. You can look it up. And that's before we look at the fact that it's driving catastrophic climate change. I really like Luke's point on it's not just about carbon. Absolutely, I fall into that trap and start talking about carbon. I think no, nature too. Absolutely agree. It's about the climate and ecological emergency. I actually helped to come up with that name because I used to be a spokesperson of Exeter Rebellion, which is where that name comes from. And we do need to talk about both. But we also, if we do that, we need to look at the nature solutions that involve things like rewilding, which I haven't heard anyone say yet. I think people think it's so obvious that we should plant trees in rewild areas. You know, nobody's really pushing for it, and we have to push for it. We have to push for it. Instead, what's happening is access to land is becoming more difficult. You know, we all know that the commons has completely been taken away. There are more landlords than ever. This land does have to be rewilded. That carbon can be sequestered by planting trees. This is something amazing that, you know, Exeter's been doing. We've planted 10,000 trees since the year 2000. That's brilliant, excellent. Let's double that number. Let's be really ambitious. Let's be a green city and put that on the map. You know, Devon could do this. Devon has a lot of land, and we are going to have to change the way we use that land. That's happening whether we like it or not. You know, the way that we meet the agriculture reform, that's all coming. That's happening. It has to happen because we have a finite amount of land. And I also, on that note, would also just say out there that we also need to think about how much of that land we can give to renewables, and really look at the numbers and be realistic about it, because it does impact nature to give acres and acres to large scale projects. And I'm not against large scale projects. Exeter's done a great job again of having a solar plant on a land, previously what was a landfill site. That's brilliant. We should do that everywhere, and we should shout very loudly about that. But let's be careful about where we're putting those, you know, in those things. Sorry, just a couple of really quick more things. I heard Germany mentioned as an example. Yes, on hydrogen. Germany is not a climate leader. Please do not call Germany a climate leader. If you look at their energy mix, they have one of the dirtiest energy mixes in Europe. They are not a climate leader. They have made a big mistake choosing to phase out nuclear before coal, and they now use more coal than ever. They have some of the highest emissions. It's frankly immoral for a developed country to do this. Well, developing countries are desperately asking to burn coal to develop the way that we did, the way that we had our industrial revolution, which caused climate change. They're desperately asking, and we're telling them no, because we don't want more carbon. Now I get that. We don't want more emissions. It's on us. We need to bring down our footprint, and we can do it quite quickly if we want to. Let's be honest. We have the technology, we have the capability. It's the political will that's missing. I don't really see that will anywhere, you know, and it's definitely not in the leading party, but I really think we could help to lead on this, you know. And again, you know, Exeter's doing our passive houses. There's 100 homes that have been built in Exeter are zero carbon. That's amazing. Let's shout from the rooftop. Let's do this in all of our cities. You know, you're talking about 60% of people there who don't have to turn on their heating. They haven't turned it on in years. That's exactly what we need to be aiming for if we're talking about reducing energy use. And the final point, I just wanted to respond to about flying. 10% of flyers, frequent flyers, took more than half of all flights in 2018. So it really is a small percentage is driving up those emissions. I don't know how specifically we should deal with that, but I do think we should think about that in terms of inequality, because if we're talking about social justice, those inequalities will worsen as the climate crisis worsens. That's true all over the world. It's true in developing countries where the women traditionally look after the families and have to get, you know, collect the water, and that water's drying up, you know. And it's true over here as well, just as we've seen with the COVID crisis that women were heavily impacted. It's going to be the same with climate change. And if we care about social justice, we should be talking about these issues. It's paramount that we talk about them. So sorry, I've run through lots of different things and I could talk all day, as I'm sure you gathered, but I just wanted to address those very specific points because they sort of came up naturally.
Okay, thanks very much. That was a very inspiring and sort of bigger picture. And now I'm going to hand over to Yvonne Atkinson.
Yes, I think I've been cast in the wrong place. I mean, I've shut down the passion, you know, but I'm talking, I've got a job's worth thing about what Devon is doing. And what I can say is completely agree with what Zion and Rachel has said is Exeter City Council under Labour are the leaders. Devon County Council is following on afterwards, and it does have more resources than poor little Exeter City Council to do the bigger picture. You know, so there's two parts to the Devon plan. One, it's how it brings down its own targets, and two, it's this partnership with local authorities and businesses to look at a Devon-wide recovery a plan post-pandemic, post-Brexit, a green recovery plan. And the key question is where resources coming from. But first of all, just on its own reduction targets, I mean, you can go and have a look at this. There was a scrutiny committee I was on only last week where we discussed the targets for the to reduce its own emissions. So it looked at reducing emissions from sources that are owned by the county council, things that it has control over its gas and electric heating and its vehicles. And it also looks at emissions from the consumption of purchased energy, i.e. where it gets its electricity from. And thirdly, it looks at emissions that are a consequence of operations of organisations that it doesn't directly control, but it does business with. So that it's got a plan to bring down those targets. Now, there's the key thing you need to know about those targets is some of the biggest. I did have some slides. I can make these available later, but I think in the time it probably couldn't go through them. It doesn't really include school buildings. I mean, you think about the buildings that Devon County Council owns. It doesn't control schools, you know, much these days, but just it doesn't deal with the schools. So there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done to make schools energy efficient. And what's happening in the southwest is there is an energy partnership between Plymouth City, Devon County, and Bristol City to look at interest-free loans for schools to help them improve their fuel and energy efficiency. And it also in the sector that it doesn't control is going to be a huge part of that is school transport, getting kids from rural areas to school each day using third-party contractors. So what does it control? Street lighting, and they put LED street lighting in, and obviously its own corporate property other than schools and business travel. So the plan that it has come up with is that it will need to invest in the next 10 years, you know, huge sums of money. Well, they're not huge sums of money. They're kind of in the region of 150,000 going up to 5 million by 2030 of revenue fund in order to reach its net zero carbon targets by 2030. But there are savings, so like there will be £500,000 worth of savings. And there's huge amounts of capital investment required going forward. Only in the next 2 years, £1 million a year is funded. So we've got 8 years where there's no funding, revenue or capital to help Devon reach its own targets for what it's got control of. So that's the first part of the Devon plan. The second part is, I've said, this climate emergency interim plan that you can go to www.devonclimateemergency.org.uk to see that plan, and it goes into a great deal of detail on a whole range of issues and energy supply, economy, built environment, transport, food, land, sea, how Devon can be carbon neutral by 2050, and it looks at local resources that can be used that don't include they don't have to come from elsewhere, that we can do by working smarter, but also huge amounts of unidentified funding that's going to make that that plan workable. And as you probably know, there is going to be a citizens' assembly to look at key issues in 6 key questions in that plan, taking place in July this year, and it's including looking at you know, whether it's palatable to reduce the amount of beef we eat, how we improve landscapes, which is what Luke was talking about, and what we do about the role of reducing road capacity, reducing traffic, all of those things. And of course, the important thing about the extent of financial incentives and legislation to be used to accelerate retrofitting of building energy efficiency and renewable energy technologies and wind farms offshore as well. And the use of financial mechanisms that will be palatable to Devon citizens. And as Yvonne has said, and as Luke said, we have to come up with policies which are going to be palatable to people if they're going to do it. So what that plan said when it was published before Christmas was, if we're going to meet net zero by 2050, that would equate to £1,992 per year per head of population of Devon. So we are talking huge amounts of money. Sorry, that's by 30. If we're going to do it by 50, that would be £661 per head per resident per year. Huge amounts of money to be taken to drive this plan forward. And the only way that those costs can be brought, well, the hope is, and I think it's the hope of the government, because it's a procrastinating do nothing, is that somehow, because of we've got this fantastic vaccine that we managed to do, the new technology will come in and will drive down costs of retrofitting, refurbishing, non-gas heating, all of it, and so we won't need these public investment, because commerce is going to come, good old capitalism is going to come in and save the day. So I think that's what they're hoping and planning is. So what are the resources that are available? Well, Devon's lost 72% of its revenue budget since 2010. We get money from council tax, we get money from business rates, ha, ha, ha. We know we've lost a whole load of money from business rates this year, and we're allowed to income generate, and Exeter, managed to get £10 million a year from car parking charges, taking, but there's not that much money you can get from income generation, to be honest. So we do rely on these grants, and I completely agree with what Rachel said, this stop-start funding, where they announce these pockets of money and then it's just so spread thinly, and all that officer time that has to go in investing in it. So I mean, just this week they've announced £54 million for electric trucks and vehicles. I mean, that's piss in the ocean, isn't it? I mean, it's how far does that go when you're thinking about the whole of the UK, and then an extra £20 million for electric vehicle charge points. I mean, how much? It costs £1 million to do a kilometre of cycleway, as we know. There's just unrealistic amounts of money, and and as Yvonne touched on it as well, the Green Recovery Plan, it was pie in the sky, wasn't it? It was long on promises, but short on how they did it, to the point where the Daily Telegraph reported the government spending plans are dwarfed by figures pledged in other European nations, and consumers to foot the bill for the Green Revolution. So what it's banking on is no taxation, no borrowing, etc., and that consumers are going to stump up. And as Luke said, there are some consumers who cannot afford to retrofit their homes. I mean, even if they could access the documentation, as Luke said, in the insulation program, which is just being withdrawn. We do need government funding. We cannot, as Luke said, local government can't fund this. There's just a big hole in our budgets. I think this last week we managed to get in Devon County some £5.8 million worth of building refurbishment schemes. So it's just all the time we're bidding for small amounts of money, and I completely agree with that. And the other point that I wanted to make about their funding plans is we come on then, none of this, the funding that they announced with their 10-point plan before Christmas, they announced £12 billion of funding. It's all smokes and mirrors. I mean, Ed Miliband said, well, we're lucky if it's actually £4 billion of new funding, and even the BBC said it only equated to £3 billion. So they just lie. So new money, this new alleged new money, £3 or £4 billion, you put it against the projected cost of the high-speed rail S2, which was £100 billion. So it's just a drop in the ocean compared to that. So they're big on infrastructure type projects. Then moving on to the budget. I know all the commentators said green measures in the budget were just, on the margins. They set up this National Infrastructure Bank with £12 billion to fund offshore wind and green retail, green bonds, etc. But there was no strategy on tax, so there was no fuel tax rise to deter people from buying cars. But maybe, as Luke said, that would have just inflicted more pain on people already suffering from coronavirus, low wages, etc., and rural areas. So, maybe that wasn't such a good thing. I don't know. We need to have a discussion about this. But there was a National Audit Office report on tax and in its environment plans, and that report said taxes are one of the tools available to government in pursuing ambitious environmental goals, but the report says the government is more focused on their ability to raise revenue than understanding the climate change impact of taxes. So government doesn't understand or assess their own relevance to its own environmental goals. So the one tool that it does have, apart from borrowing, is taxes. It just doesn't understand how it can use that to help us reach our climate change targets. So and again in the budget, public services were just left high and dry. So we've got no new money coming forward. The point that Rachel said, Devon County Council doesn't borrow money. Yes, I've been banging on about them, is while interest rates are low, why don't we borrow money for capital projects? And certainly environmental projects would have been high on my list, but that's not in their old Tory thinking at all. Though obviously this government has not been afraid to borrow huge sums of money to get us out of the pandemic. So looking forward, local government is going to take a real cut going forward in at a time when we've got these innovative plans which we're talking to people about and which we want to, but can we get them going, and either in Exeter or in Devon wide without funding? And the government does have to show leadership. It does have to come up with a clear, like they've got all these plans, like only this we're expecting the hydrogen plan to be brought out, but whether they're going to do cheap hydrogen using fossil fuels or more expensive hydrogen fuel. I mean, there's all these itsy bitsy plans, and nobody can, and it's all so fragmented, and there's no real leadership going on there. So there is a place for Labour to step up to the plate and demonstrate leadership and how we can really make this work. And I know that we did support an infrastructure a bid, but the point that Zion was making, it's not just about these infrastructure projects. It's about bringing people along, and it's about investing in them and their education, because they need to be able to work these new systems, and they need to be able to be creative and come up with new plans. And they've just announced the industrial strategies being chucked that we've been working so hard on for the last 2 or 3 years in Devon with the LEP. They thought, yeah, we were told to do it, we did it. And now they just said, no, we're not interested in the industrial strategy anymore, which was all about skills, and productivity. So I do despair. There is no money there. There's no leadership. And Devon, and it's going to be left high and dry, I think, with these plans. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Yvonne. It's great to get all that detail. So I don't know if we could perhaps just take all of the, I've got John Willis, Ruth Williams and Des. I don't know if you want to we'll start with John Willis and then go to Ruth Williams. Maybe you could all three ask your questions,
thank you.
And then we'll open it up to the whole panel.
it seems like a very small point after everything that we've been hearing. I mean, they're fantastic presentations. I'm really grateful for them. But this is particularly, I have put it in the chat as well, but it's about incentives for renewable energy. I mean, I work in the community and voluntary sector, and we've been trying to do local renewable energy installations. Some places have succeeded in having community ownership in the way that I think it was Luke referred to, community shares, where everybody has a stake in their local wind turbine or whatever. But there's a real problem with feed-in. Now there isn't a feed-in tariff to speak of to provide an incentive, and I wonder what our views are about that. It does say in the Devon Carbon Plan that we need that at a national level there needs to be some replacement of that, because otherwise, unless you've got a ready customer like Exeter City Council has with their latest solar farm, but if you haven't got one, you can't sell to the grid. It's just not viable. So what incentives, basically?
Yeah, what can we do to get Western Power to open up its grid is another sort of part of that question.
But it was provided by the government before, the incentives, the feed-in tariff, going back to Labour.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. Does anybody? So we go to. Sorry, we were going to go to Ruth, weren't we, and then to Des.
Okay. I was just going to say on that. Of course, there is a capacity problem with the grid at the moment, and in order to unlock that will require government funding. I mean, local authorities can't do this. Government. If commercial companies can't do it, the government has to come up with the money, and there is a problem with the grid, and it's identified in the plan. Until that's solved, I think, the fact that, the earlier question about can we have, a green economy going forward, we can't generate electricity if we can't feed it into the grid. So we need to solve that problem, and that's got to be solved by government funding. Other measures that could be done, I suppose, would be, through taxation, but as I said, that they're not interested in that either.
So actually, Ruth's not in the meeting. So Diane, do you want to come in?
Can I answer on the grid points? Something that I know a lot about. Yeah, grids can be managed in different ways, and community led is good, obviously. I think actually this is another thing that we could be pushing on that people never talk about, which is, getting the government to open up on things like that. And it does happen, those discussions don't happen. And it would be great to be the party that leads on it and that says, actually, how are the grids being run? Where's the money going? I mean, is it going to community-led projects? I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's renewables or nuclear or whatever, that the way it's run is a thing that feeds back to the community. So anything can be run in that way, just as councils can have more power rather than less. But these topics often don't come up and they don't get discussed, which is why I think they kind of just get away with it. But if you look at other countries and the way that their grids are run, they're much better and much healthier than ours. And there's a whole document on this, which is by the IPCC, has crunched the numbers on energy, and it's all in there, and we should hold that up and hold them accountable to it. It's actually not that difficult to do. You don't have to be an energy expert to show them the way that things should be going. It's a plan. IPCC's 1.5 warming report is a plan for how we get to 2050. All we have to do is hold them accountable to that on energy, on all different areas. But energy is a huge section in there by Working Group 3, and ask them, where are you on the map, on the roadmap? This, because it massively would automatically show them up and show that they're not really making the changes that need to be made.
And I just want to hop in and just say, as a rural candidate, I mean, this is what I hear from residents in rural communities who are not, Labour supporters, but they want their communities to be able to have community broadband networks, community pubs, community shops, community housing. and affordable community housing, and these are going to be very popular issues if we can harness them in all kinds of communities in rural areas. Sorry for jumping in, but Des, did you want to ask your question? And then I think we're sort of going to then be coming to an end.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Liz. Several things kind of together, really. We know that very soon we're going to be facing a tsunami of homelessness as the short-termism of the government in terms of how it's supporting people in the rented sector and even supporting the people who rent the homes is going to come to an end, and people will be being evicted. There's already too many people homeless. There's already right across Devon too many people who are struggling to afford any kind of housing, buying or renting. We desperately need homes. The Southwest definitely desperately needs economic regeneration, and a way of bringing this together, hopefully in an environmental way, which it has to be, I think is looking again at what we used to call prefabs, and I think they're called precision manufactured homes now. I grew up in an area surrounded by them in out of West London, and the Attlee governments did a fantastic job of rehousing thousands after the Second World War. And a modern prefab is an entirely different thing altogether. And these can be good homes. I was very interested in that notion of the passive house. You know, just that we just know so much now, and this has got to be a way forward.
I don't know if Sion and Rachel, can you maybe make a quick comment on that one, and then we'll maybe wrap up.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think you're right in terms of the difference between post-war prefabs and what's possible now. I think there is potential for that. I mean, certainly from a small district authority with a distinct shortage of land, and certainly land owned by the city council, I think it's a challenge. Yes. I think we would have to, and it's I think we should maybe try and do it, convince the volume house builders that actually that is something worth considering, as well as kind of building semi-detached suburbia on greenfield sites. But yeah, I mean, it's something that should be looked into in terms of retrofitting. The project that we've been running, I mean, our ideal would be to actually be among the leaders and work in collaboration with other local authorities, so that we could have a factory that actually made the kit to retrofit council houses, that we could then fit to our council houses, and the neighbouring authorities could benefit from as well, and that would create jobs as well. So it becomes a virtuous circle where you're attacking fuel poverty, but in doing so you're providing jobs for people working in the factories, etc., etc. Yeah.
Can I answer as well? So my understanding with the passive house houses is that 100 were built, and there's a plan to build at least 200 more, which is again amazing. It was featured in a Guardian article. We should shout about this very loudly locally, and it was originally because the council cared about fuel poverty, but now it has this added benefit that it's also dealing with climate. On the point of homelessness, actually, this is something that people hardly ever talk or think about, but there's research that shows that of everybody in our country here, or in Britain, of everybody who's going to be affected by climate, it's going to be homeless people the most, because if you think about it, weather extremes already are impacting them the most. If there's a heat wave, they're out in it, not going to have access to air conditioning. If it's cold, yes, we will try and bring some of them in. Some of them will suffer and will be on the streets, and that is already happening more if you look at the figures, and it will continue to happen more. So we absolutely, for many different reasons, need to solve the issue of homelessness, but it also will become increasingly more of a climate related issue, and therefore again is at that core, both of those things, the passive houses, the homelessness, are social justice issues it's not, we did have social justice issues and environmentalism, are the same thing. It's not environmentalism if you're not thinking about the social justice issues. So they're really good points, and I'm glad that homelessness especially was brought up.